Thank you, Rachel. Um, Thanks to Goldie and everyone else at Warwick who has helped put this event together and bring us together. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to take part in a conversation with people I've admired for a long time. So it's really exciting to be in conversation with you all. Um, One of the things I've been interested in for the last few years, ever since the Rhodes Must Fall movement erupted in South Africa and then came to the UK, is the question of why statues have become a terrain for anti-colonial reckonings, to use the title of today's event. Um, some people think that statues are a distraction, that there are more important things to think about. And so there's a lot of puzzlement over why statues have become a focus for conversations about colonialism, imperialism, slavery, apartheid, and racial capitalism. And I think that's a good question. In some ways, statues can be a distraction. Some have argued, and I've been one of them, that statues can be a means to provoke conversation about some of these material stakes in these large scale historical processes that we've been talking about. But I want to go a little bit beyond that today, actually, to think about how and why statues can be more than just a tactic, more than just an entry point into something that is putatively more important. Uh, in these conversations, we tend to privilege the material over the symbolic or the cultural, um, as if that was straightforward. And I actually don't think it's straightforward. I want us to maybe try and think about why the material and the cultural, the material and the psychic might need to be held in tension with each other in order to understand what's going on in the present moment. For one thing, the furor around statues begs questions about why they're built, and we seem to keep building statues. India is a really good example of this. The Hindu right in India is deeply invested in constructing statues of its icons. The tallest statue in the world currently stands in the state of Gujarat, which is the home state of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It's dedicated to India's first Home Minister, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who is described as the Iron Man of India, which is a reference to his role in forging the Indian Union by persuading, but more to the point, coercing many of the states that joined the Indian Union into that process. And here the history of Kashmir that Athar has been talking about is particularly relevant. So in effect, the tallest statue in the world currently glorifies the figure who is lionized by the Hindu right for for presiding over the coercive processes that forged the Indian Union today. But coming back to many of the statues in the US and the UK and South Africa that have been at the center of some of these protests, one of the things that's interesting for me is the psychic and affective investments of both those who defend and attack the statues. And I've been very struck by the range of popular direct action around statues that we've seen in recent weeks. We'll all have been familiar with and seen the scenes from Bristol where to me, it's not incidental that the statue of Colston was thrown into the water. Many of the protesters commented on how in doing this, Colston was being made to suffer the same fate as the enslaved Africans, many enslaved Africans in the Middle Passage who did not survive that passage from Africa to the Americas. And on Juneteenth, which is the 19th of June, the day that is remembered as the moment, the belated moment in which the Emancipation Proclamation arrives in the state of Texas 2.5 years after it's made. On that day this year, I remember reading a story of two statues, two Confederate soldiers who were torn down from the state capitol in Raleigh in North Carolina. One was strung up from a lamppost, and another was dragged down and placed in front of a courthouse. And I think there's something really interesting and important to consider in these moments of direct action, when protesters have seized the initiative, taken matters into their own hands, in a way that is, I think, a refreshing contrast to the bureaucratization of anti-racism that we see in too many places and that is hailed as progress in too many places right now. I wonder if there is some collective process of psychic healing going on here, in which communities that feel very strongly that they have been wronged, both by these historical processes as well as the endurance of their afterlives and legacies in the present, there is a process of psychic healing, I think, in these moments, where I think crowds have actually shown great humanity in not simply doing to others what they have done, what has been done to them, but in enacting their anger and retribution symbolically on an inanimate object, to make a statement about the injustices of the past, the way in which they persist in the present, through all of the processes that Adam and Rafif and Atar have been talking about. And in doing this, attempt in some way to move beyond these moments and processes. And it's interesting to see also that white supremacists have an equally intense but opposite investment in the statues. And we saw this in the crowds that gathered in central London to defend the statue of Churchill. But it's important to remember, I think, that white supremacists have gone further, that their actions have spilled over into murder. We only have to think of what happened in Charlottesville a few years ago, where Heather Heyer was killed as a result of a car being driven into her. Or we might think of what Dylan Roof did, murdering 9 African Americans in South Carolina, and doing this very much inspired by the symbols of the Confederacy, and indeed a figure like Cecil Rhodes. Dylan Roof famously posted a manifesto on the internet in which he describes himself as the last Rhodesian, in a nod to the kind of white supremacist politics of states like Rhodesia, which again attests to the endurance of these white supremacist legacies in the present. But coming back to the question of why statues have become a terrain for this, I think the very publicness of statues makes them available for these kinds of psychosocial investments. I think of statues as very phallic objects, not just because of their shape, and not just because most statues in public space are statues of men, although that is true. But also, I think, because like the phallus, the statue as a medium of visual representation, almost unlike every other medium of visual representation, does not need our consent to thrust itself upon us. Statues don't wait for our permission. Their very publicness means that they are unavoidable, rather like buildings. But the fact that they stand in public space, often alone and unguarded, also makes them amenable to attack, right? So they're simultaneously aggressive and insecure. And I think this is why they become lightning rods for public discontent. And this vulnerability, I think, makes statues amenable to popular reinscription and challenge, which is what we saw in the most recent round of Black Lives Matter protests in the US, in the UK, in Belgium, and in other parts of the world. In some ways, I think a well-placed piece of graffiti, there was a racist scrawled on the statue of Churchill, is a bit like a Me Too tweet. It has the power to dislodge the weight of received wisdom around these figures, sometimes more effectively than the most painstaking and scrupulous scholarship. So I want us to maybe try and attend to the psychic attachments and investments in these moments, but without losing sight of the material stakes inherent in them. Because, obviously it is the case that statues leap into significance only when somebody is able to tell a persuasive story, connecting them to some pressing material concern, whether that is the violence of the police, or the institutional racism of universities, or healthcare, or any of the other systems under which we are currently ruled. So I suppose what I'm trying to do in thinking about why statues have become a terrain for this discussion is to neither prioritize the material stakes over the symbolic, but also not to dismiss what's happening around the statues as just another culture war, right? This is a phrase that comes to us from the United States that has more recently been bandied about, I think, to dismiss, to minimize the import of what is going on in these conversations around decolonization, but rather to attend to the traffic between the material and the symbolic, to think about the ways in which both of these things are important and shape each other. Um, I do want to say a few more things, perhaps about the way in which the decolonization agenda has proceeded, particularly in British universities in the last few years. And here I think it's instructive once again to look at South Africa, which is, and not just as an analogy, but as a very a direct exemplar of a source of some of the ideas that have been picked up by decolonization movements elsewhere.
Rahul, I'll give you like 2 more minutes.
Yeah, okay. I think what's striking for me about the direction of the protests in South Africa is that roads must fall very quickly morphed into something called fees must fall, which swept across many South African universities, especially Black and working class institutions. In contrast, in the UK, the decolonization protests have proceeded mostly in the wake of the defeat of the anti-fees protest. You remember that the high point of that was 2010. And since the defeat of the anti-fees movement in the UK, we have, dissatisfied as we are with the status quo, largely taken for granted the situation of fees, the increasingly entrenched marketization of British universities. And it feels to me as if a lot of the decolonization and anti-racist work that we have undertaken in British universities has mostly taken that background neoliberal condition for granted. And this is why I think a lot of the anti-racism work that we have done in an institutionalized sense in British universities has often taken very inadequate and dissatisfying forms. It's taken the form of trying to support individuals, trying to enable individual advancement within the system rather than attacking the system vociferously enough. It's taken many of the forms that Adam gestured to when he talked about individualism, unconscious bias training, being satisfied with black faces in high places. I think, there is something deeply dissatisfying about the way in which the decolonization agenda has proceeded in an institutionalized sense in British universities. And I think we have much to learn from the direction of the South African protests in this regard. I'll stop here.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat and then we'll go through them at the end.